Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank Andrew and the London Business School for hosting today's lecture. And just over the road in Regent's Park is Britain's only professional outdoor theatre, which opens its doors each May in the hope of a sunny summer. Yet when it comes to the EU referendum, I have to say I think we've already seen drama, passion and intrigue worthy of Shakespeare's best plays. So I'm here today with CBI Director of Economics, Ray Newton-Smith, to help separate fact from fiction on Brexit. There are now just 3 months until this historic referendum. Its effects will be felt for generations. Of course, as a CBI, it's not our role to tell people how to vote, and this poll is about a complex range of factors. It's about sovereignty, security, identity. Yet, as 45 million British people consider their choice, the implications for the UK's prosperity and our economy will play a vital part. And it is in answering this question that business is uniquely placed to inform the debate. The UK's relationship with the EU deeply affects British firms. It affects UK firms that trade. It also affects those who are part of European supply chains. Whether a UK manufacturer making components for a car sold abroad, or a small retailer ordering from a big supplier. The EU matters to the UK's universities. It matters to its farms. It matters to its public finances. And European regulation affects firms of all sizes. In the months ahead, the debate will be a choice between two competing futures, in or out, and which will give Britain the best prospects for prosperity. Our role here at the CBI is to help inform this crucial choice, to bring the voices of our members and balanced economic analysis to life, and this is the purpose of today. So over the next 45 minutes, we want to do 3 things in particular. First, we'll examine what leaving might look like. Then we will look at the impact that leaving would have on business, on trade, on regulation, on investment, on different sectors of the economy, and on uncertainty. And finally, we will look at the impact of these factors overall on the UK economy as a whole. And as has already been mentioned, to put some numbers around this, we have asked PwC to conduct an independent evaluation of the overall implications of Brexit for the UK economy, and we will set these out in the final part of our lecture today. So now I'll pass over to Rain to look at the first of these points.
Thanks, Carolyn. One question that's not asked often enough is, what does leaving look like? A process for leaving is set out in Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. It's worth saying that Article 50 has never been triggered. So by choosing this path, the UK would be taking unprecedented action. Yet there are things we can say with certainty about the exit process. We know that the European Commission would draw up an exit agreement. This would then be agreed by qualified majority in the European Parliament and Council before being offered to the UK. The UK can't participate in the discussions about its withdrawal at the Council, and it can't vote on it in the Parliament. In trading terms as well, the EU would hold the balance of power. Some see the fact that we import more from the EU than we export to it as proof that they need us more than we need them. But this ignores the fact that 45% of the UK's exports go to the EU. It's our biggest export market by far, compared to just 7% of total EU exports that come here. As we've seen in our recent economic recovery, where export and productivity growth have truly been the missing links, finding final buyers for your exports can be hard. If we left the EU and our goods became more expensive for EU companies, they, on the other hand, would have plenty of alternatives to suppliers to import from within the single market. They could look to Germany or France to buy goods without tariffs or customs. We would have fewer tariff-free neighbours to choose from. So while it may be in both sides' interest to complete a free trade deal, the balance of power would be far from equal. Article 50 allows 2 years to reach this agreement. If no agreement were reached, or other EU states refused to extend negotiations, we would drop out of the EU. This would mean trading under World Trade Organization rules. which would leave the UK with significantly reduced access to the single market. Of course, the withdrawal process could include the negotiation of a new formal relationship between the EU and the UK. Over 50 countries, including Norway, Switzerland and Canada, have alternative arrangements with the EU. So some comparisons can be made. Let's start with Norway. Norway is part of the European Economic Area, the EEA, with full access to the single market for goods and services. Per capita, Norway's contribution to the EU budget is more than 80% of what Britain pays. It adopts the majority of EU regulations, yet it has no say over their creation. Free movement also operates between Norway and the EU. In terms of influence, it has no members of the European Parliament, no commissioners, and no representatives in the European Council. Switzerland, on the other hand, is part of the European Free Trade Association. It has partial access to the single market for goods and implements EU regulations in these areas. It makes payments to the EU for programs it takes part in, and freedom of movement operates between Switzerland and the EU. As a non-EU member state, like Norway, it has no formal influence over decision-making. Switzerland manages its relationship with the EU through 17 treaties and over 120 bilateral arrangements. The first tranche of these took 9 years to implement, and the current arrangements took 16. Countries like South Africa and Canada have free trade agreements with the EU, although their quality and access to the single market for goods and services varies. To sign these deals, these countries have had to adopt EU standards in a number of areas. They don't participate in EU free movement or contribute to the EU budget. And as you can see, South Africa's agreement took 10 years to negotiate, while Canada's has so far taken 7 years. But as yet, no country has ratified it. For the UK, a comprehensive EU free trade deal could take at least as long to negotiate as this. Securing a new formal arrangement would require the agreement of 27 EU member states, followed by ratification by each of them. Given all this, the Cabinet Office estimates we may not have a new relationship for 10 to 15 years. But beyond the process of leaving, what would Brexit mean for business? Well, Carolyn's going to start us off by looking at trade and regulation.
Thanks, Rain. So let's start with trade, clearly a major issue for many businesses. And if the UK left the EU, would UK's trade be helped or harmed? Well, let's see what firms around the UK had to say about this.
We trade all around the world, but probably the easiest business we do is within the EU. We have no tariffs on borders, we have all the same legislation, we put all the same labels on the cheese that we sell throughout all the EU countries. And then, when we trade into other countries that might speak the same language as us, for example, like Australia or the US, the labelling is quite different. If you look at the US, for example, everything has to be labelled separately in pounds and ounces. We go into the Australasian regions and quite a lot of the weight legislation is different. So just little subtle changes that can add up quite a lot of complication and cost.
Trading with America, we have to pick up the import duty as the supplying factory. And that means that our trading terms means we are less profitable in that market than we would be if it was a different trade deal. In the EU, it's far more simple. There is no trade restrictions, no trade import duties, and actually with Turkey, which has a good trading terms with the EU and our biggest market, we've got an advantage against the competition from Korea and China.
By us having a Brexit, it's going to make it more difficult to trade. Trade deals can be done, but we will definitely find it more difficult. We find it much more difficult to deal with other markets that are outside the EU.
At the moment, 70% of our clients would export either to the Republic of Ireland or to the wider EU community, so therefore exiting Europe would potentially have a huge impact on their ability to trade in terms of borders.
So, you've heard there many firms stress the importance of easy access to the single market. And as you can see, the EU is the UK's biggest trading partner. As Rain mentioned earlier, 45% of our exports go to the EU, and that's compared with just 16% which go to the US. The EU gives UK businesses tariff-free access to a European free trade area, the single market, and this is the most important aspect for many firms. They can sell easily to more than 500 million customers, effectively creating a home market 8 times the size of the UK. And EU trade deals also help the UK trade more easily with the rest of the world. Today, EU membership and these deals cover about 60% of the UK's global trade by value. And if the EU concludes negotiations currently underway, that figure will rise to 88% of global trade. So, assuming we stay in, let's look at how the value of UK exports will change over the next 10 years, according to Oxford Economics. For exports, it is often growth rates that are quoted rather than absolute values, and this can be deceptive as it masks the absolute size of export markets. As you can see from the red bar on this graph, today, in absolute values, our exports to the EU far outweigh those to any other market. And if we look ahead to 2025, this will continue to be the case. As you can see from the blue bar at the top, UK exports to the EU are expected to increase significantly by more than $140 billion in the next decade, and that's by far the largest source of future growth. So while the UK should clearly seize opportunities in growing markets around the world, it is one of the basic economic rules of trade that countries trade most with their closest neighbours. Yet, if the UK leaves the EU without a free trade deal, 90% of British exports to the EU by value could face tariffs. As you can see from this chart, some sectors could be hit particularly hard. Under WTO rules, World Trade Organization rules, UK textile exports to the EU, shown by the top bar, could face tariffs of nearly 10%. Transport equipment could face tariffs of about 7%, and products imported from the EU into the UK could also face tariffs, passing the costs on to customers through higher prices. The only way to avoid tariffs on EU imports would be to lower tariff barriers for all countries, but this would risk flooding UK markets with cheap imports and would do more harm than good. Of course, the UK could seek to avoid EU tariffs through a free trade deal, but it is much harder to avoid non-tariff barriers like small differences in regulation. For example, Norway, which is the non-EU country with the most comprehensive access to the EU single market, it faces additional non-tariff barriers to trade. And even as part of the EEA or EFTA, rules of origin reporting and VAT payments at borders make it harder for small firms to trade with the EU. Firms feel the difference between trading with countries outside and inside the EU every day. Just take Palletways, which is a British distribution company which employs 400 people in the UK and transports bulk goods across Europe. They say that exporting and importing to Switzerland takes 24 hours longer and costs a third more than to the EU. So in short, leaving the EU could mean the return of significant barriers to trade. Now let's turn to the global picture on how countries trade. It is hard and increasingly uncommon for countries to go it alone. As you can see from the coloured areas on this map, most countries are part of some sort of regional trading bloc, from economic unions through customs unions to multilateral free trade areas. And in the last quarter of a century, the total number of regional trade agreements in force has grown more than tenfold, from 25 in 1990 to more than 250 today. And for the UK, being part of the EU lets us go toe-to-toe with other economic giants like these around the world in negotiations. Now, some argue that outside the EU, the UK could get deals signed faster. We wouldn't have to consider the complex positions of 27 other countries in our negotiations. However, by leaving, the UK would drop out of the EU trade deals it has at the moment and have to renegotiate them from scratch. This is, in part, a capability point. We haven't had the trade negotiations to do this for about 40 years. But it's also a capacity point. We'd need to negotiate many new deals at the same time. The UK would risk being at the back of the queue, with many countries preferring to negotiate comprehensive deals with regional blocs. And as a country of 64 million, the UK would inevitably have less influence than a bloc of over 500 million. As a consequence, it's very hard to imagine the outcome would be better deals than the UK has today, unless somehow we manage to negotiate better free trade deals than currently exist anywhere in the world, with the EU, with 50 countries covered by EU trade deals, and with countries like the US, with which the EU is still negotiating. Over the next 5 years, the UK's trade position would not be improved by leaving and would almost certainly be worsened. But of course, EU membership isn't just about trade. Some claim that leaving would benefit British firms, letting them break free of EU red tape. And hence, our next question. Would regulation be lighter, and what difference would this make? While estimates vary dramatically, about 7% of UK primary legislation involves some element of implementing EU obligations. And the question is, does this regulation help or harm UK businesses? And the answer is a bit of both. EU regulation is a double-edged sword with both advantages and disadvantages. On the plus side, equivalent regulation across 28 member states creates a level playing field for EU firms. The single European sky, for example, is a great example of EU regulation, making Europe more competitive. It reduces delays and it reduces the impact of flights on the environment. And regulations allowing the free flow of data around the EU benefit communications technology firms like Bracknell-based Redwood Technology, letting them operate as easily at their sites in Germany and the Netherlands as they do in the UK. Yet, poorly designed EU regulation can be a real headache for business too. And this can be worsened by inconsistent implementation, both through adding more red tape at national level and a lack of enforcement in other member states. So again, let's see what Britain's many businesses think about EU regulation.
We're an environmental consultancy, so the EU regulation structure helps our business because all of our work is dictated by the environmental regulations that are formulated in the European Union. So it would be a huge disruption to us if we came out of Europe. We'd then be looking at a period where the UK wasn't sure about what regulations it was having to adhere to, and there'd be a lot of turmoil as the new regulations are written. So it would be a big upheaval to our business, a big disturbance.
We're in the food industry, and this doesn't get talked about a lot. I mean, people tend to refer to manufacturing generically. The food industry is very, very different. If you look around the kitchen, you'll see, we're making a load of cakes. There's something like 700 ingredients that we use across all of our cakes. All of those will have been approved by and are agreed to EU standards. If we step outside the EU, and this would be a real fear, we will suddenly find ourselves making products that perhaps aren't quite to the latest EU standard, or even worse, we don't have a say in how those standards are made.
European regulations are the biggest thing that holds back our business and threaten our competitiveness. We make sugar from cane sugar here. Europe restricts who we can buy that from and often charges us import tariffs. And in sharp contrast, the sugar beet production in Europe isn't regulated and actually is subsidised quite heavily by the European Union.
All of the EU directives around transparency and trust have a very positive impact upon consumers of the sharing economy, and that has been one of the reasons why the sharing economy has scaled up so quickly across Europe.
Some of the EU regulation is actually good, although it's not liked by this country. I think the 48-hour week thing, for instance, is good news. I don't think that's bad news at all. But otherwise, we really aren't very conscious of what this EU regulation is. We don't find it any different dealing with a firm in France or in Germany or somewhere like that. And when people say, look at all this EU regulation, I don't recognise it. I don't know what it is.
So, as you can see, there's a pretty broad range of views on regulation and its impact. And there's little doubt that regulation can cause real problems for business. Yet, overall, the impact of EU regulation can be overstated. According to OECD figures, the UK ranks 4th in the developed world for labour market regulation, shown in red on the left-hand graph you can see there, and 2nd for product market regulation, shown on the right-hand graph. So what's clear is that EU membership has not stopped us from having one of the most competitive regulatory environments in the developed world. And of course, if we left the EU, the UK could repeal some regulations currently in place. But what regulations might the UK repeal, and how likely would we be to do so? So on the screen you can see the 5 EU regulations which, according to think tank Open Europe, cost the UK economy the most money, and let's have a look at each of them. 2 are environmental, covering renewables, climate and energy. Yet, given the UK's history of leadership on environmental protection and its commitment to clean air, it's unlikely that these would be repealed, or at least they would be equivalent UK legislation. Next, the Capital Requirements Directive transposes requirements previously agreed by the Basel Committee into EU law, the vast majority of which the UK would sign up to voluntarily. Then there's the Working Time Directive. Most of the cost of this comes from annual holiday and rest break entitlements, which are likely to remain whether the UK is in the EU or not. I have to say, no CBI member is suggesting to me that the way to make the UK more competitive is to end paid holiday time for working people. These few examples just show that some of the regulatory savings often cited would be illusory, and we would need to bear in mind the constraints that may come with a new trade deal with the EU post-exit. For example, if the UK followed the Norway model and joined the EEA, it would keep nearly 95% of the most costly regulations already in place. And like Norway, which adopts 75% of EU law, the UK would be required to adopt new EU law as it was introduced. Even the Canadian Free Trade Agreement stipulates that Canada, which is more than 2,000 miles away from continental Europe, has to implement a range of EU standards. So whatever the circumstances, firms trading with the EU would have to follow EU regulations as well as UK ones. Some companies may benefit, for example, those who do not export, who are willing to apply 2 different sets of product standards, but others, and particularly small firms, may struggle to cope with different sets of rules. So overall, while some firms may benefit from deregulation, many would lose out. And just let me say a final word here in this section about the costs of contributing to the EU budget. So as one of the largest EU economies, we have historically been one of the largest contributors to the EU budget, with a gross contribution of £18.8 billion in 2014. However, we get much of that money back through a rebate and the EU's major funding programmes, which cover research funding, agriculture and regional aid, leaving a net cost of £9.8 billion, or 0.5% of GDP. This can sound like a lot of money, but it has to be seen in the context of government spending of over £700 billion, and in fact for each person in the UK, that's about £150 a year. And now Rain is going to look at what Brexit might mean for investment.
Thanks, Carolyn. International investment supports thousands of jobs in the UK. Foreign-owned companies created 85,000 new jobs in 2014 alone, with benefits for growth and productivity. So here's our next question. If we left the EU, would this foreign investment go up or down? Well, currently, the UK is doing a great job of attracting investment, both from the EU and from the rest of the world. As you can see from the red bar, the UK attracts the most foreign investment of all EU countries, about $1.7 trillion. That's more than double the investment Germany gets, seen here in yellow. And as shown by the blue area on this chart, almost 50% of the UK's foreign investment in 2014 came from EU companies. This makes them the biggest investors in the UK. And it is clear that the UK's EU membership is a large part of the UK's appeal. According to EY, 72%, almost 3/4 of investors, say single market access is important to the UK's attractiveness. Of course, it's not the only reason people invest here. Our time zone, our rule of law, and our language are all important. But the evidence shows that EU membership really counts. Another important question is, how would Brexit affect different sectors in the UK economy? Well, let me illustrate with 3 of our most important: automotive, financial services, and food and drink. While our home market is important, more than 40% of UK-made cars go to the EU, so trade is vital to the automotive industry. Leading car companies have already spoken out publicly about what the EU means for their business. BMW highlighted Britain's influence in the EU, while Toyota talked about long-term competitiveness. The return of trade barriers would have a particularly negative effect for this important sector. it would push up car prices and disrupt European supply chains. For example, a small component which can be made of metal forged in Spain with the joint made in Germany, assembled in France, and finally be included in an engine in Sunderland. What businesses tell us is that these supply chains are supported and made possible by EU membership. But automotive isn't the only sector which could be affected. As you can see from the red bar, the UK is a world leader in financial services, responsible for almost a quarter of Europe's financial sector by gross value added, a measure of output. The City of London is home to over 250 foreign banks, many of whom use the UK as a gateway to Europe. They are all able to use EU passporting rights to do business across the 27 other member states. This valuable source of foreign investment in the UK supports thousands of jobs. In the event of Brexit, it would be the loss of EU market access which would hit banks hardest, even if we did manage to secure an FTA with the EU. It's likely they would lose these passporting rights, meaning they would have to comply with an additional regime to be able to provide services in other EU countries. Of course, they could relocate their headquarters to a country with EU membership, with all that means for UK jobs. In terms of international financial centres, the next highest ranked EU city after London is Frankfurt at number 14. This headroom would give our financial services breathing space, and the city has shown itself to be innovative and adaptable over the course of history. But the harsh effects of regulatory divergence could add up over time, providing other financial hubs with an opportunity to challenge London's preeminence. And leaving the EU would also affect the UK's largest manufacturing sector, food and drink. Almost 3/4 of the UK's food and non-alcoholic drinks exports go to the EU. 8 of the sector's top 10 markets are EU countries, with Ireland making up nearly 1/4 of exports. In the event of a vote to leave, these markets would continue to be important, as businesses, not surprisingly, tend to sell perishable goods to nearby countries. So while we might hope to boost sales of some products to China, it's less likely to be fresh salmon, strawberries, or sausages. In addition, regulation of food and drink is harmonised across the EU to make trade easier. As you can see here, from production to distribution, every stage of producing food and beverages in the UK is regulated. Earlier, we heard from Richard Clothier from Wyke Farms talking about EU labelling requirements, where firms need to display detailed information on ingredients for goods sold in the EU. If British firms wanted to continue exporting to the EU, they would need to keep applying these regulations. Yet from outside the EU, we would be unable to influence the rules. And UK food and drinks firms might also have to shoulder the cost of applying 2 sets of regulations, UK and EU. So we've looked at 3 big themes: trade, regulation, and investment. And we've considered the high-level impact for 3 big sectors employing millions of people. But we also need to consider the impact of uncertainty. Uncertainty over the UK's EU relationship is already having a negative impact on investment plans for some of our members, with decisions delayed, though this impact is not yet widespread. But in the CBI's latest forecast, we have highlighted a risk to business investment owing to uncertainty ahead of the referendum. So it's something we're monitoring closely. And a vote to leave would push this down much further, as decisions are not just delayed, but diverted elsewhere. The period of uncertainty is likely to linger for the full duration of the transition period to a new trading relationship with the EU. And as I said earlier, under the defined EU exit process of Article 50, this could potentially last a decade. But let's look at what firms have to say.
The uncertainty is going to affect the pound more than anything, and that uncertainty will keep sterling weak for quite a long period. They'll help our exports outside of Europe, but our sales into Europe, coupled with our imports from Europe, is going to be a bit of a seesaw and a roller coaster ride, I think, for all concerned.
Being part of a single market is extremely important for us here at Siemens in the UK because we import and export. It allows us to do that quite seamlessly. However, should we exit, then that creates, again, the necessity to negotiate. And being Canadian, I can certainly say that it took over 7 years for us to negotiate our trade agreement with the EU. It's a lengthy process, which again contributes to the uncertainty that we will have during that time. Will investment cease? No, of course not. But it will take a period of time for that stability to regain and for us to look to the UK as an attractive place to invest.
I think being in the EU and remaining in the EU provides a certainty on which business can make investment. All businesses find uncertainty the most difficult thing to deal with. It offers risk, it undermines the certainty of reward. If we were to leave Europe, we would have undoubtedly a long period where there was not the bedrock of certainty on trading relationship, on exchange rate, or indeed on industrial activity.
A Brexit would be devastating for us. Because of all of our business we do in Europe, it would make things more difficult to trade. The uncertainty that's been created by even the question of a Brexit has been really bad for us as far as the exchange rates.
Every business in the event of a Brexit vote would have to stand back and look at its business from the point of view of contingency. What happens next? What happens to our supply chains? What happens to our customers? What happens to the employees we have? So people would have to think very carefully about what the implications would be in a period where there would be 2 years of negotiation before there would be clarity in what the terms of exit were actually going to be.
Now, we heard the pound mentioned in some of those videos, and there's an important question as to how financial markets would react to Brexit. What would it mean for confidence in the pound, our share prices, and the price we pay on corporate and government bonds? Well, as you can see from the areas circled in red, when compared against a basket of currencies, the pound has been weakening recently. This has been for a variety of reasons, including the announcement of the referendum. Indeed, the day after the referendum was announced, the pound fell to a 7-year low against the dollar. Sterling could well be the first to feel the effects of a vote to leave. HSBC and JP Morgan both expect a significant fall in the pound, with JP Morgan citing a fall of 10% in the event of Brexit. Of course, a one-off depreciation is not necessarily a bad thing. If we left the EU, a weaker pound could benefit exports and manufacturers, aiding the economy in the short term. The ultimate impact would depend in part on how the Bank of England reacted. But more importantly, our members tell us one of the hardest things to deal with is volatility. It's very hard to plan and invest when exchange rates and asset prices are moving up and down. On top of this, both Moody's and Standard & Poor's expect to downgrade the UK's credit rating if we were to leave the EU as a result of concerns around our current account deficit, our fiscal position, and overall confidence. And let's remember that the uncertainty generated by a vote to leave would come on top of a lot of doom and gloom recently around a range of global risks. When taken together, slowing growth in emerging markets, rebalancing in China, and high volatility in financial markets makes this a tougher time for the UK to choose to leave the EU. So finally, beyond the business impact, what would Brexit mean for our whole economy? As we've mentioned already, for today's lecture, the CBI commissioned an independent study from PwC looking at the implications of an EU exit for the UK economy. The study uses a rigorous economic model to estimate how 2 different exit scenarios would impact the UK economy. The study is more comprehensive in our view than in similar studies that have been done. It covers the key channels of economic uncertainty, trade barriers, migration, regulation, fiscal costs, and provides the overall impact on GDP and other variables. We have deliberately chosen what we think are relatively optimistic assumptions. First, there's the free trade agreement scenario, which we can think of as a best case scenario of a vote to leave. Here, the UK is able to negotiate a free trade agreement with no tariffs on goods between the UK and Europe. The UK does experience a modest rise in non-trade barriers with the EU, but is able to keep third country free trade agreements it currently has. We also sign a new deal with the US by 2021. Additionally, changes to immigration policy lead to a significant reduction in low-skilled workers from the EU, but a higher proportion of high-skilled workers from around the world. Of course, we understand this is a sensitive issue, and here we're only looking at the economic impact. But we should not underestimate the positive effect which migration is having on our economy. If we left the EU and really closed all our borders, it's likely we'd see more skill shortages and a greater drag on growth than set out in these scenarios. And finding people with the right skills remains one of the most pressing concerns for our members. PwC have also modelled a second scenario, which we've called a World Trade Organization case, under which the UK fails to secure a trade deal and trades under WTO rules with the EU and other countries over the period 2020 to 2026. This involves a significant rise in tariff and non-tariff barriers with the EU. The UK loses its existing free trade agreements with non-EU countries, but manages to recover them all. And in addition, we sign a deal with the US by 2026. In this scenario, the uncertainty shock, which I talked about earlier, continues for much longer than in the free trade agreement scenario. And in both scenarios, the UK no longer makes budgetary contributions to the EU. In both scenarios, we also assume that over £12 billion of regulatory savings could be made per year, based on work by Open Europe. But this includes repealing some of the regulations on climate change that we think are here to stay. So this can be seen as an upper bound on the savings from regulation. In addition, the scenarios do not consider the feedback from the impact of Brexit on the rest of the world for the UK economy, nor any additional impact from lower foreign investment on our productivity growth in the long run. So there are undoubtedly worse states of the world out there than in these scenarios. So there's the small print. But what happens when we run the numbers? In both scenarios, the largest effect comes through the investment component of GDP. PwC have calculated that even in the FTA scenario, shown by the yellow line, whole economy investment could fall by 16% below baseline. And in the WTO scenario, shown by the red line, investment could fall by up to 26% below baseline in 2020. Outside the EU and trading under WTO rules, investment would gradually start to recover, but by 2030 it would still be around 10% lower than if we had remained in the EU. And now I'll pass over to Carolyn to set out what the research says about growth.
Thank you, Rain. So this graph shows the overall impact on the UK economy in the free trade agreement, the FTA scenario that Rain mentioned. So greater control over regulatory policy means some regulatory cost savings from 2019, and that's shown by the small yellow area above the 0% line at the top of the graph there. But the small benefit of reduced regulation and a very small benefit of fiscal savings for the Treasury are greatly outweighed by the negative effects of trade barriers, uncertainty, and reduced migration. So as you can see from the large dark red section at the very bottom, the impact of uncertainty would only fade away around 2025. And as you can see from the two lighter shades of red, increased trade barriers and tighter restrictions on migration, these are the main effects that are likely to reduce GDP growth in the long run. So even in this scenario, which we think, as we've said, we think this is optimistic, Brexit's overall impact on the UK economy would be negative. Now moving on to this graph, which is of the World Trade Organization, or the WTO scenario, which shows the result as being much more pronounced if the UK cannot secure a quick deal with the EU. Here we see the same net benefit due to looser regulation, the yellow at the top, yet, as you can see, the overall negative impact is greater. The initial uncertainty has a greater impact on GDP, shown in the darkest shade of red, causing a substantial decline whose effects are felt until 2030. And the short-term impact, as you can see, is particularly harsh. The UK's ability to pursue its own external trade policy would not make up for the negative effects of the return of trade barriers and a rise in non-tariff barriers, and these are shown in the middle shade of red. This could permanently reduce, according to the PwC model, this could permanently reduce GDP by as much as 2% in 2030. Additionally, the effect of lower migration, shown by the lighter shade of red, would be more negative in this scenario and plays its part in reducing GDP in the long run. Now, this graph shows both of the scenarios, and as you can see in both scenarios, the reduction in GDP compared to the baseline scenario is significant and causes a serious shock to the UK economy. In the FTA scenario, the upside case shown here by the yellow line, by 2020 GDP would be down 3%, a cost of £55 billion to GDP on where it would otherwise have been, and that equates to a cost of £2,100 per household. And in this scenario, the FTA scenario, we estimate 550,000 jobs are lost by 2020 under the model. As the negative effects of uncertainty fade away, the UK would slowly recover, but by 2030 it would still be 1% lower, 1% below the long-term trend level, and be unlikely ever to close the gap. And then under the WTO scenario, where the UK is unable to secure a free trade deal, shown by the red line, in 2020 GDP would be down 5%, or £100 billion on where it would otherwise have been, and that equates to a cost per household of £3,700. The impact on jobs is also striking. In this scenario, 950,000 jobs are lost by 2020. The UK's unemployment rate rises from 5% to 8%. As you can see, the recovery back towards trend GDP would be slower and only stabilises in 2026 instead of 2022. But 15 years after a vote to leave, GDP would still be permanently 3% below the trend line of remaining. So, we are coming to the end of this lecture. A lot of graphs, a lot of facts, a lot of figures, but what can we conclude from all of this? What would Brexit really mean for our prosperity? Well, on the process of leaving, we'd be putting our fate in the hands of 27 other countries, and none of the alternatives on the table offers the same access to and influence over the EU single market as full EU membership. On the impact for business, it is hard to see circumstances under which the UK could get a better set of deals on trade and investment outside the EU, and leaving the EU would hit some of the UK's top sectors hardest. And current global uncertainty means that now could be one of the worst times to leave. And on the wider impact for growth, we've seen that whether or not the UK managed to secure a rapid deal with the EU, the UK would not recover from Brexit's impact on growth for the next 15 years. And in the best case scenario, we'd lose 550 jobs over the next 4 years, while trading under WTO rules, it could be closer to 1 million. So we've analysed the arguments, but of course there's one more thing mentioned right at the very beginning, and that is the business view, the view from businesses across the country. Throughout our presentation, we've heard from a range of firms, different sizes, different sectors, from different parts of the country. And at the CBI, we've consistently heard from our members that the majority, not all, but the majority, want to stay in a reformed European Union. And we committed to asking our members once again when the Prime Minister came back with his reform package, and now we've done exactly that, and undertaking a representative survey of our members, which concluded last week. The result is that a resounding 80% of CBI members think that remaining in the EU would be best for their business. So that's what our members think. Thank you very much indeed for your time, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions in just a moment. Thank you very much.